Hi everyone, so today we're going to learn how you take an idea and turn it into a testable research idea. So to do that, we're going to start out with some slides. So first off, right, to start, we need a research idea. So some great sources of inspiration would be just you looking at the world around us and using your common sense. What are some things that personally interest you? What are some things that you've maybe seen before? That's a great starting point to come up with a research idea. Another way that you can go about coming up with a research idea is to look at previous research. So you can look at research articles and look at theories that others have come up with, or you could look at empirical articles that study a topic that interests you. And actually, if you look at the discussion section, most papers at the end will actually have a small paragraph about what future research should look at. And that's a great source for new research ideas on what you can do next. And then lastly, you could also, if you're interested in more practical problems, you could study something that could maybe improve your community. An example would be if you're interested in smoking behavior in teens, you could actually look at what factors actually put a teen at higher risk to start smoking. So that would be something that you could report upon and maybe inform the community. So those are some examples of how you can come up with an idea. Once you've come up with a research idea, but the next step is to come up with a hypothesis that can be tested and also come up with some specific predictions about possible outcomes of your study. So that's what we're going to talk about next. So a hypothesis is a type of idea or question that makes a statement that may or may not be true. So it's basically a proposed explanation based on limited evidence, but it's just a starting point for your investigation, right? Because it's not well understood yet, the topic, that's why you're studying it. As a researcher, you always want to formally state your expectations, so give an explanation of why. One thing that's really important is that you remember that your question is testable. So a hypothesis always needs to be testable. Okay, so here are some of the criteria for a hypothesis. First thing, as I already mentioned, it has to be testable. So we need to be able to design a test that can test that hypothesis. If you're interested in if ghosts exist, that's not something that's testable, so that's probably not ideal for a research project. It needs to be something that's more tangible and concrete, not as abstract. Second, it needs to be falsifiable, meaning that you need to be able to either prove or disprove that it's happening. That's really important because otherwise it really wouldn't be testable again. So to give you an example for an idea would be you could look at if caffeine influences sleeping behavior. And that would certainly be something that you could either prove or disprove, right? You could say that, or you could show that giving somebody 3 cups of coffee before they go to bed influences their sleeping behavior or not, right? So you could actually do the study, give somebody caffeine, and then observe their sleeping behavior. And then repeat that if you're not giving them caffeine, so you can actually see if it has an influence. Third, your hypothesis should be precise. So your variables need to be clearly defined. That's something we're going to talk a lot more about in future chapters. So you need to come up with an operational definition of your variables. So it's very clear what you're trying to measure. And then next, you want to make sure that your hypothesis is rational, meaning that it actually fits with what we already know about the world. And then last but not least, you can see the picture of Albert Einstein. You want to make sure that as you're coming up with your research idea and hypothesis, that you try to come up with the simplest explanation for a behavior and not try to make things more complicated than they really have to be. Okay, so let's take a closer look at what a prediction is and how it's actually different from the hypothesis. Really, the prediction is a little bit more specific than the hypothesis, but it helps you to demonstrate if your hypothesis is actually true or not. So in research papers, typically at the end of the introduction, section or the beginning of the method section, you will see that the research will actually specifically lay out what the predictions are for the study. So for the example with the caffeine, right, you could say that if caffeine has no influence on sleeping behavior, you wouldn't see that sleep was disrupted. So there would be no, maybe reduction in number of hours slept, or it wouldn't influence the quality of sleep, maybe as evidenced by brain waves. So that would be an example of a specific prediction. If your prediction turns out to be correct, right, your hypothesis is supported. If your prediction turns out to be not confirmed, then you would have to go back to the drawing board, maybe come up with a different hypothesis, or maybe use a different methodology to test your hypothesis, because it's possible maybe you didn't really get to your question properly. So here's going to be a little summary. So again, first you're going to come up with your research question, so a topic that interests you that you want to investigate. An example that I came up with here is, for instance, I might be interested in if stress has an impact on our health. So if I want to come up with a more specific hypothesis, and again, that needs to be a testable research question, you could ask, do people with greater levels of stress differ in their health status compared to individuals who experience negligible amounts of stress? So one thing that's important to mention here, again, is that you want to kind of specify what you mean by stress. Right? You would have to come up with an operational definition of what stress is, what's considered negligible versus moderate versus severe stress. And then you would also have to come up with a definition of what do you mean by health status? Is it the number of colds somebody experiences in a year? Or is it, do they have high blood pressure, anxiety, depression? That's really up to you as a researcher to come up with that definition. So for the prediction, I need to know exactly how I want to define all my variables. But again, the prediction is just for you to speculate about possible outcomes of the study. So for instance, for this example, I could speculate and say people with greater levels of stress are more likely to have health problems, such as high blood pressure or anxiety. So for this example, I could design a study where I ask people to rate their level of stress, and then I could ask them if I could take their blood pressure. I could give them a survey about anxiety that I can score and give a score if they're high on anxiety, low on anxiety, or somewhere in the middle. And then I could correlate if there seems to be a trend or a correlation between the levels of stress somebody's under and their health status, meaning their anxiety level and their blood pressure. All right, so I think you have a pretty good idea now of what research questions are and how you can come up with them, how you develop a hypothesis and specific predictions. So I think you're now ready to do an in-class activity on this.